Good morning, everybody. So we are here to welcome you to our Anderson's virtual training event today. It's a beautiful morning here and excited to share some fresh agronomic knowledge for everybody. So on the docket, we are tasked with talking about crop physiology, and we chose to talk about this in the way that it ties into our high yield programs, which we should all be pretty familiar with. But what we want to do is give everybody a deeper understanding to the why. So it's easy to recommend products at certain timings, but what we really wanted to do was dig deeper into the crop nutrient needs at the specific growth stages and the functions within the plant. So to tackle this subject, we've broken it down into two parts, one being botany and the other one being crop physiology. So the botany part of this focuses on the parts of the plant in the growth stages, primarily on the outside. Physiology is going to be a deeper focus on the internal functions of the plant. So for this, we've chosen to focus on how nutrients impact these internal functions at specific times in the growth, during the growing season. One big thing to note is when we work on the high yield programs, this is what we think about. We want to ensure our recommendations are in line with crop needs. So you'll hear that as a common theme throughout the presentation.
Good. Well, thanks, Jessica. So when we take a look at plant families, as we go through the next few slides, the balance of those, we're kind of going to focus on corn, but we can take our plant families and build and talk intelligently about multiple crops that are going to be within that high yield structure because of those similar growth stages. We're not saying that the NPK requirements are going to be the same. Kind of the example there would be potatoes versus peppers. But the idea of yield determining factors, yield determining growth stages are going to be similar. The value of a calcium, a potassium, and even a boron are going to be similar within those plant families. When we take a look at our small grains or our grasses, we can take a high yield wheat program and we can start to correlate it and look at oats and barley recommendations as we move through different parts of the country. Of course, we'll need to consider our cultural practices and our crop goals, but that idea of a high yield program in a grasses are going to be very similar. So you can take this page, and that's going to give you that competitive advantage, once you know those plant families and you're out on the farm. When we take a look at, what's that crop going to be used for in the end, that end goal might be different. It might be for feed, it might be for fuel or starch or sugars. It might change what our NPK requirements are going to be, but it doesn't change that plant physiology and what those growth stages would be.
So now to get into the nitty-gritty of what we want to talk about today. So first, we're going to start with botany. Like I said at the beginning, the study of botany focuses on the parts of the plant, while physiology is going to focus on the internal functions. So in its most basic form, crop physiology focuses on photosynthesis and transpiration. And on a much larger scale, it's going to impact the vegetative growth of the plant and the development of the crop in the season from germination all the way to harvest. So looking at the parts of the plant, each part of the plant is going to require different nutrients for development and function. So just like a person where we know calcium makes up our bones, plants are going to be the same way. So we'll dig deeper into each of these parts in the following slides. But the main point of this slide is to understand that each of our product recommendations are based on where the nutrient is going and at what timing. So firstly, we're going to take a deeper look at the roots. So we talk frequently about adding zinc into a starter application. And the reason is zinc is a primary contributor to the overall size of the root system. Obviously, a larger root system is going to contribute to a more solid foundation of the plant and the more sites for water and nutrient movement into the crop. So when we're looking at how these roots form early in the season, we'll start with the radicle. And the radicle is going to be what moves reliance from the seed to the nutrients within the soil. This radicle also serves the purpose of anchoring the seed into the soil early in the season. This will be the first root to reach the starter fertilizer, which we will put in the furrow. And this is where a high orthophosphate starter comes into play. So during this time when the soils tend to be chilly and wet, phosphorus in an available form is going to be imperative to the supply of nutrients to this very quickly growing crop. We also have the seminal roots, which are going to provide additional sites for water and nutrient movement to support that early growth. And then after the seminal roots come the nodal roots, and those will provide support to the plant for the rest of the season, which will bring up water and nutrients into the crop and also anchor it. So to impact growth early on in this season, we talk about starter, we talk about zinc, and we talk about microcarb and ultramate. So each of those are going to play a role. Starter is going to provide that nutrient. Microcarb for infro and ultramate 2x2 are going to provide that carbon source to help deliver the nutrients and be a delivery system to deliver everything into the crop and help with our overall root growth. The next part is going to be the stems, which really is going to be the corn stalk, what we'll be familiar with. So within these stems are the micronutrients to support growth and movement of the macronutrients throughout the crop. So what we have noted here is phosphix, and this is going to be a really balanced ratio of auxins to support the development and the apical dominance to the cytokinins to support the vegetative growth and nutrient movement. So the gibberellic acid in phosphix, that's going to assist with the stem growth in the crop and its function cell elongation. So what we also have here is noted the xylem and the phloem, and this is going to have a role in our nutrient movement. So phloem, we have noted the movement of sugars, which is a two-way flow up and down. So when we're talking about mobile nutrients, those are going to move through the phloem, whereas in the xylem, that's going to move water and minerals, but that's a one-way track. So that's focusing on our immobile nutrients. Up next, we have the leaves. So the leaves are going to be supported with an application of overpass, and that's going to provide nitrogen. So nitrogen is a component of chlorophyll, which provides energy, hence why we call the leaves the solar panels of the plant. So remember that nitrogen is mobile within the plant, and that is going to move from lower leaves to upper leaves to support growth, which is why lower leaves tend to die off later in the season. That nitrogen is moving to the ear leaf to support the upper leaves and create that energy. So if we're going to lose leaves, we're going to lose yield because those are our solar panels, which are going to create our energy. So we also want to mention the form of our nitrogen here. So when it comes to the form of our nitrogen, we want it to be in a form that is safe and available for the crop to utilize, which is something that you can capitalize on with overpass application. So if we're looking at other products with foliar nitrogen, look at that, because other ones, like in the form of nitrate, is going to require a conversion, where other ones in the urea form are going to be immediately available for the crop to use. So moving on to the flowers and the reproductive structures. So we always say to spoon feed boron throughout the plant, and that's going to be really to focus on helping to support the reproductive structures of the crop. So a majority of our boron is going to go into the reproductive stages to support our flower and seed development. It plays a very critical role in pollination. So with that, we're going to recommend products like that contain boron, and we also recommend products like Correct, which will help support our grain quality and test weight. And the reason for that is potassium and starch are going to improve that that portion. And up next in our crop physiology and botany talk, we are going to talk about seeds. So what we want to highlight here is the seed has enough energy inside to germinate depending on soil temperature, and has enough energy to emerge out of the ground. But when we have colder and wetter environments, it doesn't always have enough energy within it to sustain growth. So as it comes to our seed application, what we want to do is focus on that starter to help get it out of the ground much quicker. And that's early in the season. When we think about it later in the season and to support creating a healthy seed to harvest, which is our grain, we want to have enough boron and Correct in there to support our grain fill and overall grain quality.
Well, good. So we're going through kind of these growth stages. We're going to talk a little bit about germination, about some about transpiration, but what we're building towards here is really how do we get ourselves to that high yield program, and making sure that we're making the right recommendations. So when we take a look at the germination, it really requires three things. So it's like a good sermon. It's going to have 3 bullet points here. We need that soil temperatures above 50 degrees. We're going to show a chart here in a moment that that shows where those optimal temperatures are going to be. We need really good soil moisture at that point in time, and we need that soil contact, which is really that seed to soil contact. The interesting part there is those are the same 3 things that a soil applied bacteria like a biopass are going to need: the temperature, the moisture, and that soil contact. So a starter fertilizer placement really here is going to be key when we get into those vegetative states. Keep that in mind in terms of that placement. We want that even emergence. Did all those plants come up at the same time? Did they come up together? We want that quicker emergence, to get that plant out of the ground. And it's really that race to V5, which is our first yield determining factor. So we know that all soil conditions, all planting conditions are not going to be optimal, and that is really one of the big benefits of an in-furrow row starter is helping that plant get out of the ground and get out of the ground evenly. So days to emergence versus our soil temperature. We know that the trend is for our growers to start planting earlier, which means that corn is going to be planted into some colder soil environments, into some colder conditions. Our goal, your goal, and the grower's goal, really is to get that crop out of the ground as quickly as they can, and that's going to be one of the values of an in-furrow row starter. Earlier planting dates, are really going to benefit from the additions of things like microcarb, which is going to be our fulvic acid, power passes, and zinc play a significant role in that emergence and really that root mass during those early vegetative growth stages. The example that I have, was right from my house this year with the fields around me. On April 23rd, soil temperature was about 54 degrees. It got really hot over that time frame, and a few days later was already up to 62 degrees. But by May 13th, so roughly 3 weeks later, it had only gotten up to 60 because we got in a cold snap. So if you think about that corn that got planted in that mid-May time frame versus a mid-April or in April versus a May time frame, that's where we've seen some of that corn that was behind early in the growing season this year. Vegetative growth stages, this is really when you start looking at those high yield programs and we start to talk about vegetative or, versus our reproductive growth stages. The 2 that you want to make sure that you're highlighting and thinking about, they are going to be that V5, that's our rows around determined, in that V8, that's the length of that ear determined. So by the time we hit those later vegetative growth stages, we've really set our maximum yield potential at that point in time. Jessica talked about the roots and the importance of that radicle and those seminal roots as they emerge, and that's really going to be that V1 or that first true leaf that comes out. Remember that these are really the roots that are going to move nutrients and water into the plant at that time. So nutrient placement is going to be huge, and that's really where we see the value of that in-furrow row starter. By the time we hit the 4th or 5th week, all of our leaves are going to be developed. We might not be seeing all of them yet, but they are developed and they're ready to go. And by that 9th week, our maximum yield potential is going to be decided. After that point in time, it's really about protecting what's there and protecting that potential. So if you think about that first 30 days, that second 30 days, or that first 60 time frame there, it's really about building the frame and the potential. And after that, it's about protecting that potential. A little bit different way to look at this. This is a little bit more of a visual on those yield determining time frames. This is really our maximum yield potential. So if you think about it, in terms of that first 30 days or roughly, 4 to 5 weeks, and then that second time frame up to that 9th week, this is really enforces the importance of focusing on those early growth stages, with the starter, with microcarb, power pass, and zinc to promote growth, and those early foliar programs that are really going to promote that plant health. Jessica talked about Phosphix, MicroBlitz, and MicroNourish, to really to make sure that we're not seeing any plant stresses at that point in time. Photosynthesis is really that conversion of sunlight into that chemical energy. We know that a healthy plant is going to produce more chlorophyll and be less than a stress plant is. That's really where that focus on early season plant health comes into play. On the water side that we need, we know we can't control water, but we can influence a root system. A larger root system is going to move water, and that's another benefit of those early season row starters, is that we have that better root mass under there to help us move more water and more nutrients. And what are the products of the photosynthesis? Probably the big one is going to be those sugars that are going to move in the phloem and help feed our beneficial bacteria. One of the things Jessica and I talk about frequently is the need to make sure that providing that first food source, whether it's a sweet and easy, a sugar, a fulvic acid with a microcarb, or a humic acid with an ultramate, to make sure that we're feeding those bacteria early in the season. And then from there, as that plant moves those sugars back through the phloem, is going to help take care of feeding our beneficial bacteria in the soil. And then transpiration, or really that movement of water in the soil into the plant and then back into the atmosphere. One of the functions that we see there is as those stomatas open, think of a foliar application with the addition of a delivery system like a sweet and easy or a fulvic acid, the ability to help move things inside that plant. We've talked before about nutrients being mobile or them being immobile inside the plant. We need water to make sure that we're providing micronutrients into that plant during the season. And if we get a time frame where we don't have enough micros moving into the plant, that's where we really, when you look at those high yield programs and you see a placement of a micronourish there, that's really during those rapid growth stages to make sure we're not seeing any deficiencies at that point in time.
Thank you, Jeff. So moving into a different topic in our presentation is going to be utilizing all of that information before and transferring it to understanding how the nutrients are brought up throughout the growing season. So looking at this, these numbers were originally in pounds and we see them in percentages now, but we converted them because we don't want to fall into the trap of saying we need X pounds of a growth stage. And that would essentially provide a hard and fast recommendation. What we wanted to do here instead was use this as more of a guide to understand the growth curve and the nutrient needs throughout the growing season. So this chart is essentially it's corn and the percentage of nutrients brought up to the plant at the different growth stages. Pretty easy and pretty easy to understand, but what we want to do here is pull out the key points from this chart in the following few slides and really talk about how they overlay with our high yield programs. So utilizing that chart is one of the ways that we developed our high yield programs, and that's what we wanted to do to ensure all of our recommendations were very sound and agronomically correct. So as we go through this, we'll talk about some of the recommendations here and how they work with our nutrient uptake. So first, starting at our seedling stage, so very early on, from days 1 to 24 of that crop growing. So when we look at these percentages, they don't look that big in terms of our phosphorus uptake. But what we want to talk about here is kind of reframing that mindset. Remember that phosphorus at this stage is going to be very integral for our crop growth. We are setting the foundation for the rest of the growing season. Remember, we talked about that root growth and all of the things that those impact from the earliest growing season all the way through the rest of the season. So when we look at this, our crop is going to be very, very small at this point. So when we think about the percentages in terms of the size of that crop, that's actually a pretty significant part of the plant at that growing season. So Here, obviously, phosphorus is going to be very important. All of our nutrients brought up through this early season are going to be integral for setting that foundation for the rest of the season. So when we look at our recommendations, what we want to focus on here will be our in-furrow row starters, focusing primarily on a high orthophosphate one, because we want that phosphorus to be immediately available for that crop to utilize and stop dependence on the seed as quickly as we can. We also have a few products here which are going to be additions, like our microcarb, our power pass, and our zinc. So that microcarb is going to deliver some zinc, manganese, and boron into the crop early in the season, as well as a fulvic acid. And that fulvic acid is going to serve as a delivery system. We also have power pass noted here. That is going to help increase our root growth. So if we can increase our root growth, improve our foundation for the rest of the season, we're going to be in a much better position for nutrient and water movement into the crop. We also have zinc noted, and zinc is going to help establish that foundation again. That's a key point with the seedling stage, and really help establish those roots and get things going very healthy and set that foundation. So when we look at our next stage, so that seedling into the rapid growth stage, we talked obviously a lot about the value of building a root system with a starter first, because we are preparing for a tremendous need for nutrients to support that rapid growth stage. And all of this is going to be taken up through the root growth, which we just built at planting. So what we want to focus on here is that increased need for nutrients heading into that 25 to 50 days. So obviously things are going to increase quite a bit because that crop is growing very, very fast. And we want to make sure that we can support that. One of the ways that I like to compare that to is going through a growth spurt. If you have a kid going through a growth spurt at home and they're robbing the fridge of just about every grocery you've ever bought, it's very similar to that. We are getting a new leaves every 3 to 4 days. And at this time, we like to say you can hear the crop grow because it's growing quite literally that fast. To support that, we like to recommend prior to the V5 growth stage, preparing for that rapid growth, an application of our Phosphix or our microblitz, focusing on our crop health and meeting our nutrient needs. Also, a few talking points specifically on the rapid growth stage is going to be preparing for preventing our nutrient deficiencies. So if you do see nutrient deficiencies, visual symptoms of those, then your yield has already been impacted at that point. So to meet the nutrient needs of that rapidly growing crop, we want to focus on making sure that the crop has everything it needs. And remember also during this growth stage, we are determining our yield, which is the number of kernels around the ear, determined by that V5 growth stage. And we want the crop to focus on that, which is its sole purpose, which is going to be establishing its yield potential. By doing that, we would recommend applying products like MicroBlitz, MicroNourish, or MicroNourish FE.
Good. So as we take a look at the next few slides, this is really that uptake pattern. If corn was planted on May 1st, this would be that early June, July timeframe that we'd be looking at. So remember, in that first 4 to 5 weeks, roughly 30 to 40 days, all of our leaves are there, all of our rows around are developed. By that 9th week, roughly 60 days, we've hit that maximum yield potential. So we can still, do some influencing on that yield potential, and we can start thinking about protecting the yield that's there with our side dress applications, Y drops, rain 360s. We'd like to maybe kind of focus in on the potassium applications of a correct, the K that's an Ultramate, or even like a product like our Easy K19. And then on the nitrogen side, it's really about making sure we're protecting that nitrogen with our Ultramate lineup, especially an Ultramate zinc. On the potassium side, in all of our high yield programs, whether it's corn, soybeans, potatoes, sugar beets, we're going to make a recommendation of some late season potassium. In our corn production, we still need about 15% of our potassium to help put on that test weight into that kernel in the form of starch. So, we know, our test weight really isn't going to influence the number of rows around or the length of that ear, but by increasing test weight, maybe from like a 54 up to a 56, we can increase the bushels in there. On the nitrogen side, we still need about 20+% of our nitrogen needs during that grain fill, which equates to maybe 25 pounds of nitrogen for that corn crop to get to physical maturity, which is going to be roughly about 32% moisture. On the boron side, Jessica talked about making sure that we spoon feed that during the growing season. So think about that grower that wants to put all their boron up front during, especially early in the growing season in a 2x2 placement, or maybe in a dry application. Or even think about our friends there in Wisconsin this year that were extremely wet through the majority of the summer. And we know that boron is extremely water soluble, and it's going to move down into that soil profile. So boron is going to be extremely important for helping move sugars into that kernel to become that starch. So maybe the take-home point on this one is, even in a down grain year, on the marketing side, a slow release nitrogen and boron with those late reproductive stages, we can still see a really good return on investment, because we have that need for boron, and we really have that need for an efficient form of nitrogen, especially in the form of a slow release nitrogen that's going to be urea.
So now we want to focus on a few other crops. We won't go nearly as in depth as we did on the corn, but just wanted to give you an overview of a few other crops, which will be soybeans, potatoes, and sugar beets, to show you how those nutrient uptake patterns are similar or dissimilar to corn. So here we have the uptake chart for soybeans. So what we have noted here is our nitrogen need. So that's going to be increased during our reproductive and grain fill stages. And at this point, our nodules are going to turn from a nice, beautiful, medium rare steak color to a bit more gray. So they're not going to be fixing the nitrogen that they were earlier in the season. But as you can see, we're going to need more nitrogen at this point. So one way that we like to make sure that our nutrient needs are met at that point to support the grain fill is going to be applying a product like Overpass 10-2-10, which does include a bit of a nitrogen in the analysis in the urea triazone forms, that slow release form, which is available to help support that nitrogen, which is needed at the later season. We also have noted here potassium. So this is going to be needed in the highest amounts from vegetative through the reproductive stages. Like Jeff had said in the previous couple slides, is we are generally going to recommend a late season potassium. And it's for all of those reasons that he had mentioned. We want to increase our test weight and grain quality. So for that reason, that's why we are recommending a product like Correct in that later season. We also have manganese and boron noted here. So during the reproductive stages, those are going to be in highest demand. So like we said, boron is going to be spoon-fed throughout the season because it's needed in such small amounts, but it is very integral for that crop reproductive stages. It's also immobile in the plant, so it's not going to be able to take it from those lower leaves and put it where it needs to be, which is why we're going to recommend that in another application like an Overpass 10-2-10. So with that Overpass application, you'll be crossing a few things off the list, which would be your nitrogen, our manganese, and our boron.
Good. So we're going to touch base here on our potatoes and on our sugar beets. And when you take a look at potatoes, really, as we start to ramp that up and kind of ramp it back down, our early season growth is really about moving nutrients into that canopy or into that vegetative growth that we see. And then once we hit that early season and we start to move towards the tuber initiation and towards the bulking side, this is really moving those nutrients that we've placed into that canopy as they start to move down into those tubers. Most of our nutrients are going to move into that canopy, really early season as we start to bulk up. Usually our root mass underneath that a little bit, so we really need those nutrients moving from that canopy down into that tuber. And as we move into that bulking size, or really that sizing of the potatoes, this is really that conversion of sugars into starches. And we have a high need for potassium at that point in time and a high need for boron right there also. So when we take a look at that uptake pattern of this, We know that potatoes use about 50% more potassium than they are nitrogen. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of our potassium needs here because it is a luxury consumer. Boron is going to be huge in the terms of moving calcium inside that plant and really building cell structure. Once we build that cell structure with calcium, that really improves quality and it really improves the stress tolerance of that plant during the growing season. In a lot of our third-party testing that we've done, where we have a row starter out there, we follow that up with a correct application. So we've got that potassium acetate there during the early parts of those tuber initiations, and then we switch it up a little bit later season where we're going to go the overpass 10-10 during that early bulking. The idea here is that we're going to make sure that we've increased the calcium at that point in time. We've increased the potassium in that canopy, and that slow release nitrogen really is there to make sure that we've got some good plant health as we finish out the season. In the 10-10, we've got a really nice manganese component in there and a boron component. So we're continually slowly feeding boron through that whole growing season. And then one of the things that we look at on those uptake patterns, is really the idea here that we're making sure that we've got plant health throughout the whole growing season. We're focusing in on boron, calcium, potassium, and making sure that that plant has enough nitrogen to finish out during the growing season. We take a look at the high yield beet programs. Very similar here. When we take a look at the beet program, we really got 3 goals in mind. The first goal is, is that our growers are going to get paid on the sugar that's produced per acre, not necessarily on the volume of beets or the tons of beets coming off that field, but it really gets equated back to those sugars that are getting produced there. So our first goal is we want to have a plant that is healthy at the end of the season so that we can continue to move nutrients inside the plant. Size is important in our best program. You're going to see correct there, roughly at that canopy closure stage. That's there to help us increase the tons per acre and the size of those beets. Our second goal, and probably the bigger goal of our high yield program, is to increase the percentage of sugar in those beets at the end of the season. So what we're going to position there is a late season application about 30 days prior to harvest. Our goal here is to increase the percentage of sugar that's inside that plant. So if we can increase the percentage of sugar content in a beet of about 1%, what we figured over our last few years of doing our testing is that's about $100 return on investment for our growers. And then the third goal of our high yield program is really the benefit to the grower and the sugar company or the sugar co-op that they're working with, and is if they can make their facilities more efficient by producing more sugar with less tons, that's really a kind of a win-win for the sugar company and for the growers. So when we build the high yield program and we take a look at our nutrient uptake patterns there, a couple things to point out is that our zinc, our highest need for zinc is going to be between the 8th leaf stage and our mid-season. Traditionally, what we've seen there is that side dress application of a UAN with an ultramate, especially our ultramate zinc right there, is we're seeing more split applications of nitrogen, and that's a great opportunity to make our zinc application is with that side dress application. Boron and manganese, really needed later during the season, and that's where our micronourish, our overpass 10-10, our correct plus really have a nice fit. As we move later in the season, we're combining our potassium acetate with a manganese and boron application, and it really fits the needs there. Our potassium demand is really going to be our highest during that canopy closure. That's really going to help us with our tons, and remember that late season is really for the sugar side of it. And then as we start to look at some slow release nitrogens, we want to switch ourselves more to a 10-10 because of that manganese and boron component. Also the potassium, but really want to make sure that we're limiting our nitrogen late season because we don't really want to, push the tons at that point in time, but we want to make sure that we're pushing the sugar with that potassium application.
So thank you everybody for joining today. Hope you got a few nuggets of knowledge to take with you. If you have any questions about anything that we discussed today, please feel free to reach out to your territory manager and they can help answer some of those questions or get you some more information. Thank you.